Well, good afternoon. We are in the second chapter of Esther. We're continuing our study here and have enjoyed it so far. Now, last week we did not have a study because we had our annual business meeting, and there was a lot of time that went into that. And traditionally we would not have Wednesday evening study on that day, in case you're wondering what happened. But we pick back up our study here. In the first chapter, we found some disturbing things about the culture in which Esther lived. We found that this was a culture in which a king, such as Xerxes, had a lot of power and often used that to build up his own ego. He hosted a number of parties, banquets to celebrate his greatness, and amongst his prized possessions was his queen, Vashti. And really, he set out to put her in an abusive situation. She declined. In his wrath and anger, he sent her away from himself, and they instituted a law that we described as a parody of God's plan for marriage, to have respect from the wife to the husband, but of course, from a biblical view of marriage, both husband and wife are to submit to the Lord Jesus Christ, and that is not occurring here with Xerxes being a pagan and Vashti likely as well, but they're not submitting to the Lord, and in this man's sinfulness, he also was not the sort of husband to which one would submit. He was certainly an exploitive, if not abusive individual, and I think that there's a number of disturbing things that we see, not just in this chapter, but again, as we alluded to last week or 2 weeks ago, to his the historical accounts of him as well indicate that he was an irrational man, and this would actually play out in largely the most pronounced example of that would be his assault on Greece, which would inevitably fail. So with that, we are going to begin looking at the second chapter today. And I keep saying we because I really do view this as a discussion, even though it is sort of a monologue here. I'm just sharing with a computer screen, but as you watch, as you interact, it takes on a different form. And so I do appreciate your interaction and anything you share. Picking up in chapter 2, verse 1, it says, "After these things, when the king's anger had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her." Now, just reading through the text, it would appear as though this is just the next morning. He had been drinking heavily. As we saw the euphemism in the first chapter, his heart was merry with wine. But so the implication there is that the next morning he woke up and oh no, what did I do? What did I say? However, there's likely some time that has passed. They had time to pass a law, for instance, and some commentators have suggested that perhaps this is even months later after he had already failed in his bid to attack Greece, and so he's been humbled. We don't know if that's the case. All we know is that this event occurs after the events of chapter 1. So it says that then the king's attendants who served him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king. Let the king appoint overseers in all provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather every beautiful young virgin to the citadel of Susa, to the harem, into the custody of Hegai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women, and let their cosmetics be given them. Then let the young lady who pleases the king be queen in place of Vashti." And the matter pleased the king, and he did accordingly. Now there was at the citadel of Susa a Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjaminite, who had been taken into exile from Jerusalem with the captives who had been exiled with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had exiled. He was bringing up Hadassah. Now Hadassah is not the name that has caught on, but rather Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had no father or mother. Now the young lady was beautiful of form and face, and when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So it came about when the command and decree of the king were heard, and many young ladies were gathered to the citadel of Susa into the custody of Haggai, that Esther was taken into the king's palace, into the custody of Haggai, who was in charge of the women. Now the young lady pleased him and found favor with him. We're going to talk about this phrase, found favor, coming up. Found favor with him. So he quickly provided her with her cosmetics and food, gave her 7 choice maids from the king's palace, and transferred her and her maids to the best place in the harem. Esther did not make known her people or her kindred, for Mordecai had instructed her that she should not make them known. Also going to play into this. Every day Mordecai walked back and forth in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and how she fared. Now, there are a lot of things that are texts that we're studying here, or in our study guide, not the Bible, kind of omit that others have noted as significant, and among those, Mordecai. Mordecai is a fascinating character. We are going to find that he gains the favor of the king later in this chapter, but here some may wonder, why is he still in the citadel of Susa at all? Why is Esther still here? They had the right to go back to Jerusalem. Why would a God-fearing Jew not return back to Jerusalem, especially when you consider that there are even psalms that indicate the distress of the Israelites, having been carried off into captivity and longing to be in the temple of the Lord? Why does he not share that desire, at least so much as he is unwilling to travel back? Some have indicated that perhaps he's outside of the will of God. Perhaps he is not walking in faithfulness. Perhaps his key desire is his own personal ambition. And there's some things in the text that might indicate that. We're going to find that he's going to work inside the temple court after Esther takes the position of queen. So he kind of pulls some strings there, or maybe Esther does, but either way, he goes from having a position to having a title. So that from a job to having a title and a position. And so that is something that's interesting. Also, his desire to submit Esther to this at all. Apparently, this is, at least in part, his idea, largely perhaps his idea, to have Esther go through this whole beauty pageant campaign, knowing that if she was not made queen, she would just be one of the king's concubines, and he has no issue with this. And we remember that God's people were commanded not to marry with the people of the nations that surrounded them, and they were only to marry other Jews with the desire of reproducing children who would come to know and love the Lord as well. But this is not a concern for Mordecai. And here in this verse, we find that he has sent Esther into this program, into this pageant, and he is walking back and forth. He's anxious. He's nervous. He's worried about how it's going to play out. And so some have indicated perhaps that is a symptom of somebody who is not confident that he is walking faithfully in God's plan. And perhaps that's the case here. That's not always the case, perhaps, but certainly when you look at all of the surrounding context, there's reasons to ask questions. Continuing our reading. Now when the turn of each young lady came to go into King Xerxes, after the end of her 12 months under the regulations for the women, listen to this, for the days of their beautification were completed as follows: 6 months with oil and myrrh, and 6 months with spices and the cosmetics for women. The young lady would go into the king in this way. Anything that she desired was given her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. 6 months of getting ready, of putting her face on, so to speak. Could you imagine this? Honey, are you ready? I'll be down in 5 months. This is the kind of thing that's transpiring here. So any men watching this who might be a little upset about your wives taking a few extra minutes and not to appeal to a stereotype, or vice versa, there perhaps it takes your husband a long time to get ready for the wives. Think about this for a minute. 12 months to get your skin ready and to look beautiful and presentable. Now, they've already described Esther as beautiful. Otherwise, we would ask sort of a basic question here of, if everybody's so beautiful, why does it take you 12 months to put on your face? But that's the culture, that's the program here, and she submits to the process. So with that, I'm going to stop reading. We're going to find that, just to summarize what happens next, that Esther has found favor in the sight of Haggai, the head eunuch. She would find favor in the eyes of the king. He would make her his queen. And so we have this woman, Esther, Hadassah as her Hebrew name, which means star. She finds favor in the sight of all, apparently, and she is elevated to this position in the kingdom. And Mordecai had encouraged her to enter this beauty contest, basically, and this is where things have gone. So with that, we're going to look at our study guide questions and sort of unpack these a little bit. We do not know what Esther was thinking and feeling. According to your careful observations of chapter 2, make two lists. First, what can be known for sure about her, and second, what you would like to know but can't. Well, we know that she was beautiful in form and face, it says. We know that she is Jewish. We know that she is willing to conceal her Jewish identity. We know that she's been raised by Mordecai, that her parents are not living. What we'd like to know, perhaps, is what happened to her parents. Again, some commentators have suggested that perhaps her parents were killed by Nebuchadnezzar. So she really, from infancy, may not have even known her parents. We don't know that for sure. We might want to know things about her character, what's she like. Did she have a desire to enter into this pageant, or did she not? What were her thoughts and feelings about it? How did she feel about the king's law that was passed, forcing women to submit to their husbands? We would have questions about those sorts of things. Second, what general observations can you make about the narrative method of telling the story? Well, this is a third person telling of the story. This is not Esther telling it from her perspective or Mordecai from his. It rings as a historical account, which is good because that's what it is, but it just provides a lot of details. It lets us into the inner workings of somebody like Mordecai, helps us to understand sort of what he's thinking a little bit. We learn more about him, I think, in some ways than Esther, because again, we know that of his context, we know of his actions here, the fact that he's willing to conceal his Jewish roots and to encourage Esther to do the same. And in this culture, she's likely to submit to his recommendation there. And so we know that a lot of things that are happening here are more descriptive, even in some ways, of Mordecai than of Esther. But as I said, it's a real historical account. And so we understand the process of queen being selected. And so even if an unbeliever were to read this book, they might find this very fascinating from purely a historical point of reference. Next, the luxurious beauty treatments sound nice, but consider their implications in this story. What details in chapter 2 reveal the true nature of the world in which Esther finds herself? Give your own nutshell description of this harem. Well, I'm just going to share this. I think that we can be rightly disturbed by what the unbelieving world finds most worthy of praise, most desirable. We find here that the king's interest is purely carnal. It's purely physical. He wants to know who the most beautiful woman in the land is. That's his only concern. There's not a concern for character, for reputation, anything along those lines. And so, as I shared in my opening remarks, his treatment of women in the first chapter was really a parody, a mockery even, of the Bible's view of what marriage should be, what relationships between husband and wife, male and female, should be. And that really carries over to this chapter. Instead of finding what we found expressed in Proverbs 31, the Proverbs 31 woman who is worthy of praise. Why? Because she loves the Lord, because she's righteous, because She exudes these godly qualities, and these are the things that we find desirable in a spouse, in a bride. We find the characteristics of somebody with whom we would want to go through life, and we would want to fulfill the purpose for which God would call us. And should the Lord call us to have children, enable us to, then we would raise children together in a home with this individual, seeing this person as somebody whose character traits we would love to pass along together. And we don't find any of that interest here. And so we find a purely physically driven culture. We find a culture that is willing to water down the substance of what makes a woman great based upon the way that she looks. And if we have to be very honest with ourselves, we see a lot of this kind of sinfulness, wickedness in our culture. I've said many times, one of the things that I find most disturbing about our culture is what we do, how we treat women in general, the way that women are pushed and encouraged in so many ways to show more and more of themselves. And I think that is demonstrable even, say, in pop culture. We see this happen with female pop singers, don't we? Well, you have a female pop singer who'll come up and she'll be fairly modestly dressed in her first a couple of albums, music videos, but pretty soon she's showing more and more and more of herself. And then what happens, she crosses whatever that social threshold is, and then all of a sudden our society mocks her. Well, she shows too much of herself, or she's this or that, or attention seeking, and all of these things. But it's like the world pushes people to show more and more of themselves, and they take whatever they can for as long as they can, and then all of a sudden they turn around and they make a mockery out of somebody. And so this is so unfortunately, I like to say that our culture is far more advanced, that we're more civilized, but we find this sort of lust evident in society, anywhere that sinful hearts exist. And so, as God's people, we need to be sensitive to that. We need to make sure that we are defining greatness not on the basis of looks or even any other kind of surface view, but instead that we look at the character of somebody, their relationship with Jesus Christ, the sort of godly qualities that exist. All right. One thing Esther does is win favor. Consider these words. In verse 9, favor. In verse 15, favor. In verse 17, grace and favor. Now think back. In Ruth 1 through 2, the words favor and kindness pointed us to God's steadfast love for his covenant people. In week 2, the whole Bible connections. In week 3, gospel glimpses. We find these same words in Joseph's story. The favor found by Daniel is the same, Hesed. Here's the question. What similarities do you see in the circumstances of Esther, Ruth, Joseph, and Daniel? Well, we find three things at least. The first is situations beyond their control. Daniel was carried off into captivity as a child. Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers. Ruth's husband, father-in-law, brother-in-law died. Esther here, her parents have passed. She's been raised by her uncle. She was taken captive into a foreign land. So there are exterior contextual notes that are beyond their control. Nevertheless, they do have control of their responses to those situations. And so what we find in each of these cases is submissiveness. We find a desire to submit to God. And in this culture, so often submitting to the law of God meant submitting to family members who had authority over them. We saw that first expressed in Ruth. We find that here in Esther, that she's willing to submit to Mordecai, and we shouldn't just treat that as being the result of a misogynistic culture. I think we could also see this, I think it'd be more appropriate, if we're going to view this positively at least, as being her willing to submit to family out of a desire to honor God and the family structure. And so that's perhaps what we see. But we've seen submissiveness in a number of ways. Joseph, in Potiphar's household, for instance, was willing to faithfully serve, even in prison. Daniel we found submitted to the Lord, also was willing to obey the law to the point that it did not disagree with God's law. Once it did, of course, we see what happens. Now, the third thing is that they each received God's blessing. And God's blessing is not explicitly stated in Esther. Nevertheless, we find these terms, favor, used repeatedly in this book to indicate God's hand, his providential hand of guidance upon her life and upon circumstances that are really disturbing. Sometimes the circumstances of one's life are troubling, and the sinful actions of other people really negatively affect us. Nevertheless, even in the midst of that, even as we live in a fallen world, God is still at work in our lives, drawing us closer to him. This is the final note that we're going to make, because we're going to look at Mordecai and what he does in delivering the king next week. I want to tie that in with the next chapter rather than dive into it here. So this is the last prompt for today. Of course, we are not told that the favor Esther won came from God. We are reminded repeatedly, however, of the people to whom Esther belongs. Find those reminders in this chapter. What is their effect? Well, we find Mordecai's family lineage shared, and of course they are relatives, so we have that. We know that they're from the tribe of Benjamin. We also know that Esther has been told to suppress her national identity. We're told that, I believe, twice in this chapter, that she does not indicate that she is Jewish. The results of that are that she was able to win this beauty contest. Although this is purely a physically conditioned contest, nevertheless, there was anti-Semitism in this culture, quite a bit of it, and unfortunately throughout the history of the world, we find that that's not uncommon. Because of that, they faced real danger, and certainly faced the probability of not finding the sort of favor that she found in the harem. So we find that this is going to set up the rest of the book, but for now, we find that there's a willingness to hide their true identity, both Esther and Mordecai. We have questions about why that is, but beyond just fear of physical danger, why wouldn't somebody want to be known as the follower of the living God? We have questions about that are going to go unanswered. Nevertheless, we find that she is a Jewish woman, and we're going to find that she is going to be given an opportunity as a Jewish woman to speak on behalf of her people. So again, sometimes God puts us in situations, he allows us, I can even say, to live in certain situations that may even be trying and may test our character in many ways, but we have an opportunity to submit to the Lord in all ways and to find favor in his sight. And I pray that that is certainly true for you. Next week, we will be looking at the end of chapter 2 and all of chapter 3. May the Lord bless you.